welcome to Fireside Chats with Candidates. I'm Joyce Short, and my co-hosts this evening are Ellen Polivy and David Liston. And our special guest is Tali Farhadian Weinstein, who is running for Manhattan District Attorney. Ms. Weinstein came to this country from Iran as a small child. And since then, she's law clerked for Judge Merrick Garland, for Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. She's worked for Attorney General Eric Holder, and she's been general counsel at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office under Eric Gonzalez. So welcome to Tali. And I'd like to start by asking you basically, how did you get into law? Why did you choose law as a career?
I came to New York as a refugee from Iran. We left while the revolution was happening there because there was just violence all around and it became really impossible to live. And we arrived at JFK Airport on Christmas Eve of 1979. And I probably, because the tickets were cheapest that day, let's be real, but it turned out to be kind of a miracle because we had fake tourist visas, I think now, in our hands, and one-way tickets, and what you need to start a new life in our suitcases. And I know as a lawyer now that the INS officer, the airport officer who met us, could have just turned us around and deported us on the spot. But instead he said, come in, it's Christmas, come back to self-deport. And that gave my family a chance to find pro bono lawyers who showed us how to make our claim for asylum that we were afraid to go back to our country of origin. And 10 years later, them staying with us the whole way, we became American citizens. So, I think about that a lot, Joyce, what it means to have the power over somebody else that officer had over me and how to exercise it with humanity and with discretion. And I really tried to model my career on that, and then just to fight for the things that my family came here for, which is fairness and safety, the fundamental building blocks of opportunity and prosperity.
Well, it certainly seems that he had a great deal of compassion. Pass that along. It's a fabulous story.
Thank you.
And can you tell us, of all the things that are on your platform, what are the three most important to you, and what do you intend to do about them?
Yes. So let me just give an overview of what connects these things, because this is an office, the district attorney, that should always be important and on your mind, but people aren't really conditioned to think about it as an elected office. And now I think it's so urgent that we get it right, that we get safety right, as the city recovers from this past year. And the things that are really at the top of my platform are all things that in some way are connected to the pandemic and the recovery of New York City. So top of that list, of course, is gun violence. And I have prosecuted gun violence cases myself. And, now we find ourselves in the bloodiest year in New York City since 2012. We've had over 300 shootings already. We are in May. Shootings had doubled last year, which included all the months that people were staying at home. Murders were up 50%. And now you all know the stories. A shooting in Times Square in the middle of the day, a shooting on Park Avenue, 95th Street in the middle of the day. And I think we just absolutely have to start there. And I have a plan to put a gun violence coordinator right in the front office of the DA's office, and to use a whole array of strategies to get at this problem. And we can dig deeper into that if you like, Joyce. Second for me is gender-based violence, which I think is just a thing that we've been so kind of casual about, and that's endemic. It's domestic violence and sex crimes and sex trafficking and gender-based hate crimes. And let's just talk about domestic violence. This was already at such high levels before the pandemic. Then, of course, it got worse because people were stuck at home often with the person who was abusing them, with nowhere to go and having to make some really hard choices. Am I going to try to leave and expose myself or my kids to the virus in a shelter and whatnot? So now we have, even more to take on. And, you know, then the third is that this office has had a real special role in economic crimes and enforcing the rules of fair play in the industries that are here in New York. And on this score too, we know, for example, that wage theft has really gone up during the pandemic, employers skimming wages, and now people are more insecure, right, about losing their jobs, so they're not going to report it. Cybercrime, like elder fraud, has gotten worse. All of these scams preying on people who have been, you know, alone at home for a whole year, promising cures to the coronavirus and government benefits, you know, all in a ploy to get your personal information, to take advantage of you. So our plate was full before, but it is fuller now.
So now you mentioned just now cyber crimes.
Mm-hmm.
Is there some sort of a division between what is prosecuted by the federal government in a cybercrime,
Yeah.
and what's prosecuted by the district attorney's office in a cybercrime?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. And as you know, Joyce, I was a federal prosecutor for 6 years, and I also worked at the Department of Justice, as you mentioned, for Eric Holder, working on, you know, national criminal law policy. And we've got a lot of prosecutors running around in New York. So we have local prosecutors like the Manhattan DA's office, and then we have federal prosecutors like the Southern District of New York, the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is here, and some others too. And, you know, historically, sometimes there's been competition between the offices because they can both bring the case. Sometimes they collaborate. I worked on a lot of sort of joint investigations when I was a federal prosecutor, and sometimes they sort of split up the universe. And I think that, you know, the DA at the very least has to do the cases where in each one, there might not be a humongous amount of money at stake, but so it might be too small, right, for a federal prosecutor, but it matters to the victim. It's humongous to the victim. And then if you take it at scale, you know, that scam artist who is calling you and you and you and you, you know, when you put it all together, that's a crime with, you know, enormous dimension.
Exactly. So now I'm going to turn over the torch here to one of our two co-hosts. Who wants to go first? David.
You want to take it
Ellen.
first?
There you go.
Sure, it's up to you, Ellen. You decide.
Okay, so I just want to, I'll take the very first and then I'll hand it quickly to Dave. Tali, wonderful to meet you. And you know, you have so much experience and you have so much money that in this, that it looks like you're probably a front runner here because, you know, it's an 8-way race and you only have one choice. And so all the extra progressive candidates are probably going to split all the votes and then you're going to slip in. That's my guess. But so I want to point this out because I'm concerned specifically. I'm a social worker and I deal in the healthcare field. And the DA's office and how people are, you know, the mass incarceration and the people in the Black and brown community that are, you know, over policed and overwhelmed by it, it perpetuates the system of poverty that then perpetuates the system of you know, because our healthcare is dependent on our jobs, and you know, the system of where people are in jail and then they can't get jobs and then et cetera. It's a public health crisis as well as everything else. So the DA's office is very very instrumental in solving the problems of poverty and crime and healthcare, et cetera. So you didn't do so well in the public defender's list. So I'm kind of curious what you have. So I'll read you just one line that concerned me, and I'd like you to respond to it. They said that of all the people, that you're the second to lowest on your receptivity to understanding the very real harm done to communities by traditional DA practices. So what can you say to that?
Yeah, so I have a lot to say to that. And Ellen, I first of all, let me just say that I share so many of the concerns that you have raised. And in fact, one of the things that distinguishes me from the other candidates in this race, certainly not the only, is that I am actually the only one who has done the thing that we are all talking about all the time, which is how to reform an office of local prosecution to make it more fair, to control for racial disparities, to stand down from the cases that, as you say, are only making people's lives worse and not better and are not advancing public safety. And I think that that is part of why I do find myself in a strong position, because there are a lot of ideas, people have a lot of ideas, but this is hard work, and showing that you've actually been able to do that work, I think is really important. And the Brooklyn DA's office, I think many people would agree, is regarded as the national model in progressive prosecution. These labels, I think, have kind of worn out their welcome. What is a progressive prosecutor? Can you be progressive without wanting to prosecute anybody? But you know, I think that we did it. And you could hear from my priorities, which I laid out for Joyce, that they really are centrally about protecting the most vulnerable people from the worst kinds of harm, and not just bringing cases for their own sake, and not bringing cases indiscriminately without the kind of concerns that you expressed. I also want to say it's great to be talking to a social worker. You know, one of the things that I learned in the Brooklyn DA's office is that you don't learn everything that you need to learn in order to do this work properly in law school. And so DA Gonzalez, for example, had social workers on staff for all sorts of things, including for a really innovative gun program that is part of my gun plan for Manhattan, to allow a small number of young people who were found to possess a gun and had never committed any other crime to really have a second chance, rather than go through the ordinary course, go up to prison 3 to 5 years, come back hardened. And I think his great insight was that program was run by social workers. They were in a better position with their expertise and training to pick out candidates who could succeed in this program, and then to design a tailor-made program for that person. Maybe one person needs mental health counseling, and one person needs job training, and maybe someone else needs family therapy. So I very much intend to have a diverse staff in the office that has lots of different competencies in it, including yours. You know, that report, that's an opinion piece, right? So everybody's entitled to their opinion. Whoever wrote that report heard that. I am very glad to speak for myself. One of my competitors is a member of that organization, so it's also not exactly the most objective analysis. But you know, as I said, opinions just fine and people's feelings just fine, but I actually have a record of doing reform and doing it in a way that doesn't cost anything in terms of public safety. On the contrary, I think we enhance it when we do the right thing.
Can you explain to us just a little bit more, with a little bit more depth, the you know, the reforms that you made and where? What type of reforms, and was that in Eric Holder's office?
So this was in Eric Gonzalez's office, the Brooklyn DA. So really a good analog, Joyce, because it's an office of about the same size as the Manhattan DA's office. And I went over there because when Eric Gonzalez was elected, he had the ambition of making it this national model that I've described, and he recruited me to be his general counsel and part of his leadership team.
Wonderful. Dave, up to you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Tali, for coming on to our program. I used to work at the Manhattan DA's office. Yeah. And so I know it's a really special office. It has been for a long time. And I'd love to see it continue to be a prominent, respected example to the world of how a DA's office can be run. So a lot of what you're talking about is good to hear. You just tweeted about an hour ago, the subway is the lifeblood of New York. It is essential we feel safe on mass transit for the city to truly recover. Combating violence on the subway will be a priority when I am district attorney. Can you elaborate on that? How will it be your priority? What will you do to combat subway violence?
Sure. I wrote that because there was some reporting today about increased assaults in the subway, and particularly against people who work in the transit system. They're really vulnerable to attack there. I'm actually the only person in the field, as far as I know, who has supported making some assaults on people who work in mass transit, more serious crimes. So, for example, during the peak of the pandemic, it became a thing to spit on people who work in the subway at a time where spitting on somebody could actually be really exposing them to great harm in spreading the virus. And I think that particularly sensitive to the space of the subway and being confined there, it's even more important to take on things like hate crimes, people getting pushed, afraid to, and because eventually what happens is you don't even go into the subway, right? If you're afraid that you or an elder or someone, in your family is going to get pushed. I'm hearing now, for example, there are all these groups on Facebook where Asian New Yorkers are finding pairs to go onto mass transit together because they're afraid of being victims of hate crimes. I take that quite seriously. The subway has also been a site for a long time, David, as I'm sure you know, of sexual assault. And some of these are misdemeanors, but they're serious, like upskirting people and groping, the things that you can do in a confined space that really are transgressions that are really harmful to others. And I plan to hold people to account for them.
You yourself, so when I was a prosecutor, people always would say to me, oh, it must be a dangerous job. And
Yeah.
I never quite knew what they meant. And I sort of laughed it off. And I never had any bad experiences, but you had a very traumatic experience. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, share with us the experience and tell us to what extent or how it might inform how you'll be as a DA.
Sure, and probably is the healthiest thing is to just laugh it off a little and not get into the darkness of it. But look, I did have a scary experience, and I really am worried, about the demoralization of prosecutors and the demonization of prosecutors and people who are in law enforcement. When I was pregnant with my third daughter, and I had two other little kids at home, so my older girls were, I guess they were 1 and 2, and I was pregnant, I was prosecuting a murder case. And at some point, we got word that one of the people who I was prosecuting had put out a hit on me, was trying to hire people who were in his gang, who were not incarcerated while he was being detained before his trial, to kidnap me. And I think I'm going to leave out some of the gory details, but it involved my baby and me. And, I'll say a couple of things about it. First of all, I was so grateful to the spectacular professional law enforcement agents who looked after me during that time. So everybody just whipped into shape. I got a call from Maine Justice that from Washington that everybody was on it, and the FBI investigated the threat at the same time as that the U.S. Marshals, drove me around and made sure that I was secure physically. And I already had a lot of confidence in my colleagues in law enforcement, but that certainly enhanced it. And then, David, I think all of us learn something about ourselves sometimes when we are tested. And for me, it was just totally obvious that what I had to do was just to keep doing my job. And continue to prosecute the case. And I did until I gave birth, and then the trial happened after I gave birth. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
I was looking at your website, and there was a headline, so there was a heading, small business. And I have to admit, I looked at it and thought, the DA's office keeps getting pulled into every aspect of life, and it has to solve this problem, that problem. And I thought, what on earth could she be talking about with small business? And then I read it, and it made a lot of sense.
Oh, thanks.
So it might be, can you sort of talk us through how the DA's office can have an impact on small businesses? And I think it's a timely question and a timely topic.
Yeah, thank you. And you're forgiven for your reaction because, you know, in this campaign, there are a lot of folks who have ideas about the DA's office doing all sorts of things that have nothing to do with our mission and what the people are electing us for. And I'm glad you saw that here. The connection is really clear because, you know, I've been going out and talking to voters as much as I can, right? All around this borough that is really diverse, but there are common themes no matter where you are. And one of the things that I've been hearing from people is that crime and a difference in personal safety has made it harder to run your small business, either because something is happening outside, right? You could be a restaurant, you could be a shop, and if the street outside doesn't feel safe, people don't want to come and patronize you, all the way to these thefts where people are walking in and taking what they want and walking out. And there's just this sense of insecurity and disorder, and everyone's already beaten and bruised by the pandemic, right? And then we have, on top of that, you know, I spend the afternoon today in Chinatown, and I'm always hearing there now about people feel like their shops are targeted in a hate crime, right? That an attack on property can be a hate crime, and are just even kind of nervous to go to work. So part of what I wanted to make clear is that all of that really matters to me, and that you can report directly to the district attorney's office when those things happen, because I think sometimes these institutions of government can feel really far away and inaccessible, and you're just a small business, right? So who cares about you? And this was to say, this is a community also. I mean, as you know from your time there, local DAs have all sorts of different ways to organize how they are reaching, you know, people who are our constituents. And this seemed to me like a distinct group with a distinct set of issues that are particular to this time. And I wanted to make clear that it matters to me.
Great. I could keep you for the next hour with more questions, but I think I should pass the torch back to you, Ellen, or to Joyce. Who's up?
Go, Ellen.
Okay. So what is your thought about decarceration, and do you have plans to have alternatives to incarceration?
Yeah, so Ellen, the first line of our Bible in Brooklyn was incarceration is a last resort. And it's funny, like that one sentence has gotten people so in some ways worked up. I think any good or ethical prosecutor should say incarceration is a last resort. Sometimes it is absolutely necessary, but you're not going to take away somebody's freedom or liberty unless you have to. That was always totally obvious to me. And even when that was sort of first unveiled as an aspect of reform in the Brooklyn DA's office, to a person, every prosecutor said, well, of course, incarceration is a last resort. But in order for it to be a last resort, you have to have other pathways and diversion programs, as you said. And I think that that's really what it means to be a modern prosecutor's office, that you have these off-ramps. Sometimes public safety requires incarcerating somebody. I'm super clear about that. Sometimes before trial, sometimes after conviction. But sometimes you might do better from a public safety perspective by addressing some of the underlying issues. So the Brooklyn DA's office has programs for diverting people with, for example, a chemical addiction to drugs into treatment rather than incarceration, or mental illness. You know, I mean, there are so many people cycling through the criminal justice system who have an underlying mental illness. And I think particularly for some lower level offenses, this is a really good solution, because I don't think we can just sort of announce as a society, you know what, we're never going to prosecute you for graffiti or for trespass or for stealing some goods from a pharmacy. But we may also not think it's necessary or good to send you to jail for those things. And so then we develop alternatives.
So the idea that there's a list that some of the other candidates will not prosecute. Do you have a list like that? Or I think you said you wouldn't have a list like that.
Yeah,
so
I mean, look, there are a couple of things which I do think we should never prosecute, largely because these are crimes that have nothing to do really with public safety and have been totally racially disparate in their enforcement, like marijuana possession or loitering for the purposes of prostitution. But Ellen, as I think you know, I'm really not a fan of these lists generally for the reasons that I've just said. I think that they defer the hard work of figuring out what is the just thing to do in a particular case. And so, yes, it is true. My competitors have some lists that are just really breathtaking, and they keep adding to them. So just yesterday, to a person, I think except for one person, they all said they would never prosecute trespass. Well, you know, sometimes it's not just to prosecute trespass, but you know, if you live in a NYCHA complex and people are occupying the stairwells and the lobby in a way that you can't send your grandkids down to go outside and play, you might want to say that that's not okay, right? And so that's the hard work, is figuring out strategies for how to make good decisions in the statutes that sometimes should be enforced and sometimes should not be enforced, rather than just throwing your hands up and saying, you know, I'm just never going to do it.
Tell me about bail.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, when somebody gets arrested, then they lose their job. It keeps them occupied, and they get a record. And then, you know, even if they're not getting a record from it, they may not show up at work. They may, you know, mess up with some other things, some other obligations that they had. So there are problems with even arresting people for minor crimes. So, all right, let's go back to the bail. And,
Sure.
and I just wanted to point that out, that sometimes having a list of things that you won't prosecute means that the police won't bother with arresting somebody for that, and then the person won't have the perpetuation of problems that occurred because they were arrested.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to point that out. So tell me about the
understand.
bail reform. Do you have?
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, I was a proponent of bail reform because we had a real problem across New York State of people being held because they couldn't put together a couple $100s, you know, some small amount of bail while they were presumed innocent. And mostly this was happening to people of color and to poor people. And there were about 10,000 people a day on Rikers Island, just to give you a sense, when bail reform conversations, you know, started to happen. And I thought that that was wrong. Remember, incarceration is a last resort. Like, is it really necessary to hold these folks? And DA Gonzalez had a wonderful innovation in Brooklyn, by the way, before bail reform happened at the legislative level. We reduced our pretrial population in 1 year by 50%. We sent the smallest number of people per capita to Rikers just by teaching the assistant district attorneys to be more careful and smarter in how they asked for bail. And he had this device where they would have to write a little report every time they asked for bail at arraignment to the leadership. And we know we would all review these at night. And we did that without any harm to public safety. So all of that is very much to the good. Yeah, and I agree with you. You know, bail, being detained could be really disruptive and destabilizing and ultimately degrade public safety, right? In addition to being unfair. However, I do have a different position on bail than my colleagues in the race, because I don't think we got the bail reform that we should have. New York is the outlier state. It is the only state in which, when you're making a decision about pretrial detention, you can't think about public safety risk. Is this person going to come back out, reoffend, hurt somebody else while awaiting his trial? We're only supposed to consider in New York flight risk, which is important. Like, I want to know if you're going to take your passport and run away and not come back. But I also want to know if you're going to be a danger to somebody else while you're out. And I think we have to have a mechanism, you know, if we go at this again, to allow for that to be a consideration. And I think the next DA can be an advocate for that. You know, in the meantime, I should say, Ellen, and I bet you know this because you seem, you know, very much in the trenches on this, that there are aspects of the new bail law that are really just underutilized. They're basically unfunded. So it gives judges lots of things that they can impose short of incarceration to mitigate a lot of risks, electronic monitoring and other pretrial monitoring. But Nobody said how this was supposed to be paid for. And I think that that's a real shame. I think one thing to explore is whether the Manhattan DA's office can use its slush fund to pay for some of that.
So I'd like to interject a question myself here. And
Yeah.
it has to do with sexual assault and sex crimes. What changes, what reforms would you implement in the sex crimes unit? Do you have a sense of what you want to do there?
I do, and I'm very proud that a group called the Reform the Sex Crimes Unit evaluated everybody's plans in this space. This is a group of victims and advocates and experts, and rated my plans the best and the most transformative. And that's why folks like Gloria Steinem and the National Organization of Women and Robbie Kaplan have endorsed me, because this is such a huge priority for me to transform how we deal with gender-based violence more generally, Joyce. So it's sex crimes, but it's also domestic violence and sex trafficking and gender-based hate crimes. And, I think that while each of these are a different kind of crime, they require some shared expertise, including, for example, a better understanding of consent. I think, too often we just think that if a person consented to a marriage or a relationship or going to a party or being in a certain industry, that she consented to the violence against her. So that's a part of it. I also think that we have to have alongside of us all the other things that victims of these crimes need. They need the protection of law enforcement and accountability, but also often services, right? And I think that we can offer all of that sort of in one stop.
You've actually brought up the right word to the right person. I don't know if you're aware. There's a little book sitting right behind my head.
Oh, I am not aware, and I'm not familiar with that. Forgive me. Did you write that book, Joyce?
Yeah.
Am I in so much trouble for not reading your book before I came on?
That's okay. Not a lot of people.
Just going to order it right now.
You're going to hear a lot more about it, because we have a bill currently pending in the Assembly and in the Senate that will actually reform the definition for consent in the laws of New York State. And I'm going to put it to you in one simple sentence. Consent is freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. Mm. So my next question to you is, what do you think of that definition? Because that's the bill that's now pending.
So I am not going to answer on the spot.
Okay, I don't blame you.
On a bill I just learned about from you, but as you know, I'm really.
You and I can have a separate conversation.
Indeed, and getting that right. Yeah.
Yeah, but certainly it would be very, very helpful for you to be aware of it and to support it, because it will be the very first law of its kind that actually introduces the definition for consent in the penal code of a state. And
let's chat, Joyce.
Absolutely. So who's got the next question?
Well, I do have one here about domestic violence. How will you treat domestic violence victims who commit crimes against their abuser? Will you prosecute them?
Well, so there is a new statute that is an excellent statute, Ellen, called the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, that says that you have to consider a person's own experience with domestic violence in deciding her culpability and what a just sentence would be, let's say, to her when she commits a crime. And the statute actually gives people a right to go back and be resentenced if that was not considered adequately. And when I was in Brooklyn, I set up a process to work collaboratively with defense counsel to bring some of these cases, instead of just being adversarial about everything, to mutually agree in cases where this was not fully taken into account. And so I do think that's important. I mean, every case is different, but it is certainly a factor.
Great, thank you. Dave, I'm going to throw the ball to you. Handle to you, yes, because
okay.
I think we have to stop at 9:15 or 9:10. So,
So you might be. This might be it, David. Make it a good one.
Oh boy, it's a lot of pressure. So Tali, you've been through a lot of debates, right, and a lot of panels. Can we get your help? Give us a good question to ask the remaining candidates with whom we're going to meet, and then answer your own question. How's that?
Oh my gosh, you're really putting me on the spot with such
Yes.
that is such a good question. It really is. Yeah, there are so many things that I've wanted to ask. Well, I'm just going to throw a random one at you,
Okay.
because it's going to feel a little bit out of left field, but I think I think it's important. You know, there's almost to a person, the other candidates have said that they have a problem with collecting criminal asset forfeiture funds, the proceeds of crime. But they also all talk a lot about all of the community things that we need to fund in order to get at the root causes of crime, to make communities healthier, to make them safer. So I'd like to understand better, you know, why that is. Why would you abdicate that opportunity? And generally, you know, what is your approach to spending that money? Because, you know, I think everybody wants for there to exist a robust array of institutions all around the city that help put us out of business, right? We all want the crime not to happen in the first place. How are they going to get there?
Okay, so that's a good question. And
Well,
And
yeah.
now he wants you to
I
answer
mean,
the
my
question.
answer was embedded in it.
I think I got it. Yeah, it's basically
Yeah.
baked into the question.
Yeah, I think it's just to do
Yeah.
that and to redistribute it for good.
You did a great job, because honestly, that I haven't heard anyone talk about that
Well,
issue.
we filled out some survey about it, you know, yeah.
And so for the sake of our viewers, asset forfeiture is the concept that when someone commits a crime, the government comes in and perhaps seizes, right, the proceeds of the crime.
Right. The ill-gotten gains, you know, whether you're a bank and it's money, or you're, you know, running a drug trafficking organization and it's the bricks of heroin.
And what about returning some of that money to the victim? Does that go back to the victim when you recover?
Well, so that's restitution, and that's also something that you are obligated to do in some cases.
Mhm. Excellent.
All right, I wrote it down, Tali. I'm gonna ask people this question.
Oh dear, I hope I mean, feel free to reject it if it's not interesting enough.
It's a good one.
Okay, folks, so I think we've kind of creeped up on the last minute here. So I want to just remind everybody that the primary election takes place on June the 22nd, and your vote is your voice. So everybody should speak up loud and clear with their votes on June 22nd. And I want to thank Tali for sitting in the hot seat today, and let everybody know that our next fireside chat will be with Alvin Bragg. Okay, so another candidate for district attorney. But we wish you the best of luck, Tali.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Good night, everyone.
Thank you for being here. And we're going to blow out the torch and save it for next time.